Welcome to Conversations with the Future. My name is Oscar Johnson, and I'm Academic Director of the Center for the Governance of Change. We are an applied research center studying emerging technologies and their social, political, and economical consequences, really trying to figure out how the world is changing on a breakneck speed. Today, we're going to talk about our democratic debates and the role and influence of big tech platforms. The last weeks, we've seen an unprecedented move to deplatform President Trump, and we also seen the takedown of the secret encrypted app Parler from Amazon Web Services. Yesterday, Joe Biden said we must stop the culture of manipulating facts. And here we are today with two exceptional guests trying to help us sort this through. We have Mark Scott, who's Chief Technology Correspondent from Politico. And we also have Alicia Wanless, who is Director for Carnegie Endowment's International Peace Partnership for Countering Disinformation Operations, or Influence Operations. Welcome to you both. I wanted to ask you, first of all, the last weeks we've seen an unprecedented move against deplatforming, against coordination between a number of social media companies. Are we looking at the new normal here today? Mark, you go first.
Thank you for having me. I never realized that deplatforming would be such a sexy topic when I got into this. I think right now it is the new normal, purely because if you've taken down the Twitter and Facebook accounts of the former leader of the free world, it's very difficult to go back on that. So when you see Facebook removing political accounts in Uganda, and also clamping down across Eastern Europe and even in Brazil, this has to become the new normal because the cat is out of the bag. And therefore, to bring that back and to say that the Trump effect was a one-off is a little bit disingenuous, because what happens with Trump maybe was the extreme, but what we are seeing across the board, both from political and non-political actors in every part of the world, is this has now become par for the course. And therefore, for Google, Facebook, and Twitter to say we're not going to do this anymore kind of is a bit too late. That's my view.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think a very clever person said that big tech companies are damned. Everyone is agreeing that they are destroying democracy. Half of everybody believe that they're destroying democracy because they're not censoring more. And the other half is believing that they are destroying democracy and free speech because they are censoring this. What's your point of view, Alicia?
Well, first up on deplatforming, I would say that it isn't necessarily new. It has been going on for a while. Reddit was doing it in 2015, and then in 2018, there were coordinated cases, especially around taking down InfoWars, that happened across the platforms. So I think it's safe to assume that they're going to continue that approach, but albeit still cautiously, because it is a very blunt tool. In terms of, platforms being bad or good for democracy, I mean, you took the words out of my mouth. It doesn't matter what the companies do, they're damned. Someone's bound to be unhappy. And the bigger question here is, as a society, how are we going to come to a deeper understanding for the role tech companies and play in democracy, right? There's a lot of research needed that's beyond reach, because the mechanisms for fostering that collaborative research don't exist. So things like measuring influence operations across platforms, or their effects, or the efficacy of interventions like deplatforming, it's simply really difficult to pull that off in the current environment.
It's as you're saying, there's always been a certain sense of moderation within these platforms. And I mean, this platform have their terms and conditions, and they have a special set of terms and conditions for elected officials. But I've heard a lot of people saying, well, if we do this to Trump, why don't we do this to Khamenei? And if we do this to Khamenei, why don't we continue doing this? And I think that this is really where, I mean, on the one hand, you have the alt-right that has been targeted and has been banned, who are furious about this. But then you also have another set of people being quite uncomfortable with the big platforms taking these decisions. Should the government step in here? Should governments be the one providing the guidelines for how to do this or not? How comfortable are we with big tech private companies in Silicon Valley doing this? Mark.
I find it really ironic that you have people like Angela Merkel coming out and defending Trump, saying that it's very problematic for Twitter to take his account down. My view on that is that the policymakers and politicians have had years to do this, and they've frankly not done a good job. I mean, we can go back to the German NetzDG law around online hate speech in 2018 as sort of a precursor to where we are now. That wouldn't have solved the problem either. And therefore, progressively, both in the United States with Section 230, with the Europeans, with now sort of the voluntary code of disinformation that frankly didn't work. There have been efforts to do this, but they kind of outsourced the real tough decisions to the platforms, mostly because either the policymakers didn't want to, because it's tough, or to Alicia's point, they didn't have the right metrics and data to make those decisions. So for them to turn around and say now, after frankly many people have been calling for regulation for years, to say, well, hang on, this shouldn't be in the hands of companies. I suppose my question is, where have you been? This is something that could have been looked at and should have been looked at for years. And therefore to come now, when it's finally got to the boiling point where you have riots on Capitol Hill, feels a little bit trying to close the barn door after the horses bolted.
I couldn't agree with that anymore if I tried. And this has been a big issue, is that we have, first of all, a systemic problem, right? What's happening in the information environment is essentially systemic. And yes, the companies play the biggest role. And as it currently stands, the companies are pretty much the only point of intervention on doing something about this right now, outside of like third-party fact checking and those types of interventions. And what we've been seeing across the different sectors, the stakeholders who should be at the table to make these decisions, whether it's industry, government, academia, civil society, and media, because they also play an important part. There's a big disconnect between those groups, and they don't necessarily speak the same language. They don't have the same level of understanding for what the problem is, and there isn't a lot of infrastructure to bring them together. And then add to that, I mean, the people who really should be regulating this are, politicians. And unfortunately, politicians also have a vested interest in being able to use the same tools that are problematic. And so without clear lines in the sand around what's acceptable in terms of influence operations versus what's not acceptable, it's a mess.
Yeah, and I think, thank you for that, Alicia. And I think you put it well in a piece you wrote a couple of months ago about this is basically about persuasion. Let's not talk about disinformation. Let's not talk about fake news. I mean, fake news is a concept that got on foot and walked off, and misinformation as well, because a lot of it is, true or truthful and amplified. It's age-old persuasion, but that leads me to question. This goes to both of you, but what is the actual problem? Because on the one hand, maybe we're having this discussion only by the fact that, the big tech platforms are big, not necessarily because they are doing something wrong. Others would say it's the incentive structure in the tech platforms to monetize attention and maximize attention that leads to sensationalist and filter bubbles. And some, maybe even more clever, would say, hey, this is just human nature. We like sensationalism. So I want to try to get, your guys' view on really, like, what is the core problem and what is the new dynamic to this?
I'm going to sound really, really cynical, so forgive me, but I think it's a bit of plague on all houses. I think that there's a role that us as online users need to take, and this isn't about media literacy or whatever, but sometimes just don't click on that thing that you think you shouldn't, right? I think that the platforms also have commercial incentives on the algorithm front to sort of push us through sensationalism, although I think that's somewhat overstated and under-researched. It's very difficult to know if there's causation versus correlation. And then finally on the politician front, again, to Alicia's point, they are part of the problem because they are on these platforms, using them to communicate with voters, etc. So not to say that it's everyone's fault, because then it becomes no one's fault, but I think personal responsibility in terms of what you click on, who you believe, questioning sourcing, both from the mainstream media and elsewhere, but also from platforms. I agree that just because you're big doesn't mean you're bad, but I think greater, forgive me getting wonky, but algorithmic transparency about how specific content gets served up to people would be very useful, just to know what the ecosystem looks like, because right now we just don't know those answers.
Yeah, The other thing that I think is important here is that we do have a tendency in a present situation to want to think that everything that we're dealing with is incredibly novel, right? So if you look throughout time, there's always been a group of actors in the information environment who are making a profit off of spreading, whether it's fake news or partisan information. You had newspaper editors doing it in the American Civil War. You had people training people on rhetoric in the Peloponnesian War. So throughout time, we have this problem which suggests that humans have an issue with influence and information. And every time there's a new introduction of technology that changes how we engage with it, we have a bit of a bigger problem that emerges, whether that's like an increase in the volume of information or how people are using it that ends up leading to conflict. At the same time, setting that aside, there's one common denominator that is present no matter what the time frame and no matter what the invention, and that's humans. Humans are the ones who have developed the technology. They're the ones running the companies behind it. They're the ones setting the laws. And if we don't kind of reframe it to look at that and then really understand, how does information influence people, and at what point does their agency in terms of making free and informed decisions get taken away such that democracy is in peril? And I don't think that we look at it systemically like that. And that's probably the backfooting that we're sitting on that prevents us from really moving forward.
Okay. So, but isn't there a case to say, there's a lot of this that's been around for forever, but, people have not been storming Capitol Hill believing it's a ring of pedophiles sitting there and stealing the election. Just having, I think it was 70% of Republicans believing that the election was stolen, says something about, the strength of disinformation, or does it, Alicia?
I would say yes, but not necessarily new to the current environment. So if we go back to the American Civil War again, you had rampant disinformation, especially pushed in the South, about what would happen if a Republican government came into being. And some of those news editors were also pushing stories that the vice presidential candidate for the Republican Party was mulatto, right? Like they were pushing fake news and hysteria in order to whip the South up to, continue supporting slavery. So it's not necessarily new. I think it's newish, but without that historical perspective, I think we're prone to a little bit of hysteria around a problem that is age old. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have a massive problem that we need to address. It just means that maybe we need to take a breath and approach it with that longer term perspective.
So I have to say, my favorite thing to do right at the moment is to read 19th century history in the US, purely to that point that a lot of this stuff has been around for a while. So again, the doomsayer in me likes that. And I think that is very key. I think that the thing that has changed though is the speed and the veracity of how this works. So maybe sort of, Twitter, Parler, etc., and smartphones didn't exist in 1860, but newspapers were pretty widespread. So I think, Alicia, I hate to say I agree with you 100%, but you're right. It is a question of, let's take a breath. What is the problem we're trying to fix here, rather than just trying to say it's big tech's fault or politicians need to overregulate.
And
Okay.
just to build on Mark's point there are three key differences. And one is definitely the reach and speed at which information can travel. The second thing is that, unlike in the past, anybody can get involved, which also increases how we can obfuscate the origins of, an influence operation that's coming. And then the third thing is the amount of data that can be generated on individuals at the same time that we have an increasing understanding for psychology and human decision making. So this is kind of like the trifecta that makes this a lot worse than it was, but we still do have some historical reference points to.
Yeah, okay. So I would probably pick up on one in particular in terms of what is new, and that is, Facebook Messenger, you have 4 to 5 times as many messages being shared than SMS. And then that is again what I was asking about before regarding the sheer size of what we're seeing of these big platforms. And I think Facebook is controlling 4 out of the 6 platforms with more than a billion monthly users. So that is Facebook, WhatsApp, Messenger, and Instagram. But because of the sheer size and because of the sheer reliance among individuals on these platforms, do you think that there's a case to start perceiving them as a public good, as the new public square, as the new town square where we have a new democratic debates? And should they thus be regulated as such? I mean, take for instance, you have telecoms with the with the need to carry all the other operators' communications, or you have, for instance, banks are not allowed to deny people to open a bank account there. Could there be such similarities to get away from to really live up to the notion that these platforms are platforms, nothing else? And I think that also ties into what is different.
I think the COVID crisis and pandemic from the last year has shown that they are utilities, not only platforms, but also of social media platforms, but the ubiquity of Amazon, for example, in delivery. The problem is that the current competition and sort of utility regulation doesn't really fit these type of platforms. So there's, I mean, forgive me for getting wonky again, but there does need to be some sort of hybridization in which you go, okay, if there is a public utility element to this, the current laws don't fit that. So what do you use, right? And there's obviously going to be a significant amount of lobbying around that. But from my discussions, both within companies and with policymakers, we're not there yet. I don't think the let's really regulate them as utilities has got much traction out of beyond some populism out there, purely because it's tough. And just because it looks like a telecoms company doesn't mean it is a telecoms company. And therefore, I agree with you that there's a legitimate argument to be had around that. But what I think we're lacking at the moment is the actual legal basis to apply utility law to these large digital platforms.
Yeah, this conversation is where all I do is build on Mark. I think the qualitative difference now with social media platforms is that they are, yes, a publisher in the sense like traditionally book publishers have been a publisher, but they're also where people can actually express their own voice. So it's the equivalent of people being able to go out in public and say whatever they want, if they want to, in a public square. And I think that combination with the ability to amplify those voices is what really makes this a strange situation. It's a new situation. Now, that does make them somewhat of a public utility or a public space that definitely needs consideration for how it might be governed, or better yet, what kind of etiquette could we actually present and push in terms of like encouraging people to adopt norms. But the bigger problem is that these are not national spaces anymore to be legalized. They're international and global. The platforms are not limited by a single country. And so the question is, how do you manage to regulate those spaces domestically in a nation or a state versus how do you actually manage that on a global scale that will fit, all the countries where they operate?
The analogy I always like to use is that it took 40 to 50 years to get international maritime law on the books through the UN. Do we really want to wait 40 to 50 years to do the same thing with internet regulation? And as much as the system right now doesn't work for sort of cross-border, companies that make frankly more money than average countries do on a per GDP, we have to work with the system that we have. And I think there is a potential for some sort of, bad analogy, but a coalition of the willing, particularly within Western countries, to work together on that. But to look to the UN or some other international body to create out a sort of system of law, that brings in Russia and China, and are we comfortable with that? And second of all, it's going to take a long, long time. And I don't think we have time to wait around like we did with the maritime rules.
Mark, you've been covering the Digital Service Act, the new EU, and the latest legislation. How far along the right direction do you see them, or is this age-old states trying to capture anything and trying to grasp the grand scale of the problem, or is it more nuanced than that?
I think that in the world of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. I think there's not much other options out there in terms of what it could look like. And it's taken the Europeans years to get to the point where they've, I'm not sure how much your readers, your viewers know what's going on with the DSA and the DMA, but it turns into hefty fines if they don't take down illegal content when they're informed by it, potentially antitrust rules that would sort of label Google or Facebook gatekeepers and therefore restrict their access to new markets. There are some significant problems with it, and we're going to spend the next 2-3 years trying to hammer those out with policymakers and lobbyists going at it already. My frustration is that I wish there was an alternative to play off that. And I look to DC, particularly within the Biden administration coming in, and I frankly don't see much realistic legislative reform going on in DC as a counterweight. So as much as I think the Europeans have got some things wrong, right now we don't really have another option in terms of how things may play out. And therefore, is it perfect? No, but at least it's something that we can start with, versus in the US where, again, I sound cynical, but there's not much going on, and it hasn't been going on for years.
Alicia, what do you see and what do you hope from the incoming Biden administration?
I am also a cynic. So I haven't really seen much emerging from the US that I would say is leadership in this space in terms of being able to address the problem. And moreover, as I think people become more aware that it is not a dichotomy between foreign and domestic activity that is the problem. It's actually how domestic actors are engaging in this space and the lack of lines in sand around that make it even more difficult and less likely that I think the US and the Biden administration will tackle this head on.
So to conclude the discussion, we are all happy that the lines in the sand has been drawn this time. And we're thinking, some have argued that, shutting down, for instance, alt-right groups will only move it to more encrypted places, and it will be harder to track, harder to keep track of. But in the end, we're thinking that Facebook, Twitter, AWS are doing the right things, shutting these down. And will we rely on them to make the right calls in the future?
I'm going to finish on an optimistic note because I've been a Debbie Downer throughout this whole conversation. When my mom is asking me about Parler and content and things like that, I think we're in a good place. I think there's greater awareness with the actual general public that something is wrong. And I think even go back 12 months, we didn't have that either. So as much as I don't think we have answers, we are at least having that conversation now. And I think that's only for the better of everyone, both in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere. The question I have now is I hope we don't lose the momentum, particularly with the Biden administration facing a COVID crisis, partisanship, racial issues, and yada, yada, yada. So I think what I would love to see, taking off my journalistic hat and put on my campaigner hat here for a second, is some sort of at least Western, if not global, discussion about what happens next, because it feels like a pretty good time to have that, but history moves on pretty quickly.
Yeah, I would agree again with all of that. I mean, I've been researching this space since 2014, and I remember when very few people understood what the topic was, or with that even agreeing that there was a problem. And so in that sense, there's been a big increase in awareness, and also in terms of people contributing research in this space coming from multidisciplinary fields. And so that I think is definitely a positive. Are the companies doing enough? I think we're putting a lot of pressure, rightly so, on companies to fix a problem that is essentially human, but they could do more. And one of the ways in which they definitely could do more is finding some sort of mechanism for facilitating research collaboration between them and academia that is independent and actually informs, our understanding of influence operations and what we can do about it reasonably. And that's really, truly missing. And that needs to happen, not just like in the US, that needs to also be a global effort, because not every place experiences or engages with the information environment the same way. And so I agree, we need to have some sort of a global coalition that comes together, even if that is mostly in the West, but like to start to articulate what are the norms, especially for democracy, not just in conducting their own influence operations, but how do they go about ensuring the integrity of their information environment?
Well, I think those are both very good notes to end on, both the optimism and the call for more research, speaking as a research center and being completely transparent with that. You can follow Alicia's latest writing at Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. You can follow Mark's latest commentary on these issues as well, and writing and reporting on Politico. And you can follow our research at cdc.ie.edu. Thank you very much for listening.